A racist teacher publicly humiliates a black girl in front of her class. But when her father stands to speak, his words expose a truth so powerful, it silences the entire room and changes everything. The morning sun streamed through the classroom windows as the bell rang, signaling the start of another school day. 11-year-old Tiana Brooks shuffled to her desk, clutching her books tightly against her chest. She was a quiet, hard-working student who often went unnoticed, but today would be different. A day she'd never forget. Tiana loved learning, but recently, her enthusiasm had been overshadowed by the sharp comments of her teacher, Mrs. Helen Greene. Mrs. Greene, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes and an air of superiority, was known for her no-nonsense demeanor. However, her behavior towards certain students, particularly Tiana, often crossed the line into something darker. As the students settled in, Mrs. Greene stood at the front of the class, tapping her ruler against the desk for silence. "All right, everyone," she began, her tone brisk. "Let's see who's prepared and who isn't." She scanned the room, her gaze landing on Tiana. "Tiana," Mrs. Greene called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Why don't you come up and solve this equation?" Tiana hesitated. She felt the weight of her classmates' stares as she rose from her seat and walked slowly to the board. Her palms were clammy, her heart racing. Numbers were her favorite, but under Mrs. Greene's cold gaze, even simple math felt insurmountable. She picked up the chalk and began writing, her hand trembling slightly. The room was silent, save for the faint scratching of the chalk against the board. "Is that what you think the answer is?" Mrs. Greene's voice sliced through the silence like a knife. Tiana paused, glancing nervously at the teacher. "Yes, ma'am," she stammered. Mrs. Greene shook her head, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Well, class," she said, turning to the students, "it seems some people aren't quite as clever as they think." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Tiana felt her cheeks burn with shame as she stared at the board, wishing it would swallow her whole. Mrs. Greene stepped closer, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Maybe if you spent more time focusing on your studies instead of, well, whatever it is you do, you wouldn't embarrass yourself like this." Tiana's vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, determined not to let anyone see her cry. The humiliation was unbearable, but what hurt more was the implicit message behind Mrs. Greene's words. "Sit down," Mrs. Greene finally said, waving dismissively. Tiana returned to her desk, her head bowed. The whispers and giggles from her classmates felt like daggers in her back. That night, as Tiana sat at the dinner table with her father, James Brooks, she was unusually quiet. James was a hard-working man, a factory supervisor who always prioritized his daughter's happiness and education. He noticed the sadness in her eyes immediately. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked gently, setting down his fork. Tiana hesitated, then slowly recounted the events of the day, her voice breaking as she described Mrs. Greene's words. James listened intently, his jaw tightening with every word. By the time Tiana finished, her father's eyes burned with a mix of anger and resolve. "No one," James said firmly, "has the right to make you feel small. You are intelligent, kind, and capable, and I won't let anyone tell you otherwise." Tiana nodded, feeling a flicker of hope in her father's words. But James wasn't done. He knew this was bigger than just his daughter. It was about standing up against an injustice that had gone unchecked for too long. As Tiana went to bed that night, James sat at the kitchen table, staring at the school's contact information on a piece of paper. He clenched his fists, determined to make sure the world understood just how incredible his daughter was, and just how wrong Mrs. Greene had been. The next morning, James made a decision. He would attend school with Tiana, not just as her father but as her defender. What he planned to say wasn't just for Mrs. Greene. It was for every child who had ever been made to feel less than they were. The next morning, James Brooks woke early, ironing his best shirt as Tiana got ready for school. He didn't say much, but his quiet determination filled the room. Tiana, still anxious from the previous day, watched her father with a mix of hope and uncertainty. When they arrived at the school, James parked the car and walked Tiana to her classroom. She clutched his hand tightly, her small fingers trembling. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to do this." James knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "Sweetheart," he said softly but firmly, "I do. You're my daughter, and it's my job to protect you. No one, no teacher, no person gets to treat you like that." As they entered the classroom, the usual morning chaos of chatter and laughter died down. All eyes turned to James as he walked in, his towering presence commanding attention. Mrs. Greene, who had been sorting papers at her desk, looked up, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cold and dismissive. James's voice was calm but resolute. "Yes, you can. I'm James Brooks, Tiana's father. I'd like to have a word with you." The class went silent. Some students exchanged nervous glances, while others stared in curiosity. Mrs. Greene hesitated, her lips tightening as she glanced at Tiana, who was quietly taking her seat. "This really isn't the time," Mrs. Greene said curtly. "If you have a concern, you can schedule a meeting with the office." James didn't budge. "I think now is the perfect time," he replied, his voice steady. "You insulted my daughter in front of her peers yesterday. You humiliated her. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again." A murmur rippled through the classroom. Mrs. Greene's face flushed, and she glanced at the students, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Brooks, I don't think it's appropriate to discuss this here," she said, her voice tight. "I think it's very appropriate," James countered. "You embarrassed my daughter publicly, so let's address it publicly." The tension in the room was palpable. Even the students who usually whispered or doodled during class were sitting upright, eyes glued to the unfolding drama. Mrs. Greene straightened, her tone turning defensive. "If your daughter misunderstood something I said, I'm sorry she feels that way. But I don't believe I've done anything wrong." James's expression darkened. "Misunderstood," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You told her she embarrassed herself. You implied she wasn't smart enough. And you said it in front of the whole class. That's not a misunderstanding. That's unacceptable." Mrs. Greene opened her mouth to respond, but James held up a hand. "Let me ask you this," he continued, his tone sharp. "Would you have spoken to another child that way, or is it just mine?" The class was deathly quiet. Even Mrs. Greene seemed caught off guard by the directness of his question. "I treat all my students equally," she said stiffly, "but sometimes tough love is necessary to push them to do better." "Tough love," James repeated, his voice now tinged with anger. "Tough love is about guidance and support, not tearing a child down in front of her peers. What you did wasn't love, it was prejudice wrapped in authority." Mrs. Greene's face turned crimson, but before she could respond, the classroom door opened, and the school principal, Mr. Turner, stepped inside. A tall, balding man with a calm demeanor, Mr. Turner had clearly been alerted by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes darting between James and Mrs. Greene. James took a deep breath and turned to the principal. "I'm addressing the way this teacher humiliated my daughter in front of her classmates yesterday. It's not just about Tiana. It's about ensuring no child is treated this way." Mr. Turner's expression shifted to one of concern. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Mr. Brooks," he suggested. "No," James said firmly. "This isn't just a private matter. These kids need to see that what happened yesterday wasn't okay. They need to see that standing up for yourself and for others is important." The principal glanced at Mrs. Greene, whose discomfort was evident. She shifted on her feet, her authority seemingly shrinking under James's unwavering gaze. "Mr. Brooks," the principal said carefully, "I assure you we take these matters seriously. If you'd like, we can arrange a formal meeting to address your concerns." James stared at him for a moment before nodding. "Fine. But I want it on record that I'm not letting this go." He turned to the class, his voice firm but compassionate. "Kids, remember this. No one has the right to make you feel small. Not your peers, not your teachers. No one. You deserve to be treated with respect no matter what." As James turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Tiana's face. She was watching him with a mix of pride and relief, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. As James stepped into the hallway, Mr. Turner followed, his face unreadable. "Mr. Brooks," the principal said quietly, "if what you're saying is true, then we have a much bigger problem than just yesterday's incident." Later that afternoon, James received a call from the school's front office, confirming a meeting with Mrs. Greene, Principal Turner, and a representative from the school board. It was scheduled for the next morning, and James knew this was his chance to demand accountability, not just for Tiana, but for any student who had ever been treated unfairly. That evening, James sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open and papers scattered across its surface. He was preparing, revisiting school policies, anti-discrimination guidelines, and statements from students who had witnessed the incident. Tiana sat across from him, quietly watching her father's determination. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you really think they'll listen to you?" James looked up, his expression softening. "They have to, Tiana," he said firmly, "because if they don't, I'll make sure someone else does. This isn't just about what's right for you. It's about what's right for every child." Tiana nodded, her father's words giving her strength. She went to bed that night feeling a flicker of hope she hadn't felt since the incident. The next morning, James walked into the school's administrative office, his shoulders squared and his head held high. He was greeted by Mr. Turner, who offered a polite but cautious smile. "Mr. Brooks," the principal said, extending a hand, "thank you for coming in." James shook his hand, then followed him into a small conference room. Inside, Mrs. Greene sat at one end of the table, her expression tense. Beside her was Ms. Alvarez, a representative from the school board, who looked professional yet approachable. James took a seat, placing his prepared notes and documents neatly on the table. He glanced at Mrs. Greene, who avoided his gaze, then at Principal Turner and Ms. Alvarez. "Thank you all for meeting with me," James began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here because my daughter was publicly humiliated and insulted by her teacher yesterday. What happened wasn't just inappropriate, it was harmful." Ms. Alvarez leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "Mr. Brooks, we've reviewed the initial report from Principal Turner, but I'd like to hear directly from you about what happened." James recounted the events of the previous day, detailing Mrs. Greene's words and their impact on Tiana. He spoke with precision, his voice unwavering as he described the hurt and humiliation his daughter had endured. When he finished, Ms. Alvarez turned to Mrs. Greene. "Mrs. Greene, do you have anything to say in response to Mr. Brooks's account?" Mrs. Greene sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't mean to hurt Tiana," she said finally. "Sometimes students need tough feedback to help them grow. If she misunderstood my intentions, I apologize for that." James's eyes narrowed. "Misunderstood your intentions," he repeated. "You didn't give her constructive feedback. You embarrassed her in front of her peers and made her feel like she didn't belong. That's not tough love, that's prejudice." Mrs. Greene opened her mouth to respond, but Ms. Alvarez held up a hand. "Mr. Brooks has a point," she said, her tone measured. "Regardless of intent, the impact of your words on Tiana, and likely on the other students who witnessed it, cannot be ignored." Principal Turner shifted in his seat. "I've spoken to Mrs. Greene about her teaching methods in the past," he admitted, his voice cautious. "But this incident clearly crossed a line. We need to address this in a meaningful way." James leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the principal. "It's not just about addressing this one incident," he said. "It's about creating a culture where no child has to endure this kind of treatment again." Ms. Alvarez nodded. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Brooks, and that's why I'd like to propose a plan moving forward. First, Mrs. Greene will attend mandatory training on equity and inclusion. Second, the school will implement clear policies to ensure incidents like this are handled swiftly and appropriately. And third, I'd like to see a program introduced to educate both staff and students on the importance of respect and diversity." James considered her proposal for a moment, then nodded. "That's a start," he said. "But I also want Mrs. Greene to personally apologize to my daughter, not because I'm demanding it, but because Tiana deserves to hear it." Mrs. Greene hesitated, her discomfort evident. But under the weight of the room's silence, she finally nodded. "I'll apologize," she said quietly. As the meeting ended, James stood to leave, but Ms. Alvarez stopped him at the door. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice low but earnest, "your courage to stand up for your daughter and speak out is exactly what this school needed. But I hope you're ready, because this might be only the beginning." The next morning, Tiana sat at her desk, fidgeting nervously. She knew what was coming, a public apology from Mrs. Greene. James had explained it to her the night before, but she still couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. What if it wasn't sincere? What if it made things worse? James arrived early, standing quietly at the back of the classroom as the students settled in. Mrs. Greene stood at the front, her usual composed demeanor slightly shaken. She glanced at James before clearing her throat to get the class's attention. "Good morning, class," she began, her voice more subdued than usual. "Before we start today's lesson, I have something important to say." The room went silent as the students turned their attention to her, sensing the unusual tension in her tone. "Yesterday, I said some things to Tiana that were unfair and hurtful," Mrs. Greene continued, her gaze shifting to Tiana, who stared down at her desk. "I was wrong to single her out and speak to her in a way that made her feel small. Tiana, I owe you an apology, not just as your teacher, but as someone who should have treated you with more respect." Tiana hesitated before looking up, meeting Mrs. Greene's eyes. The words hung in the air, and though they weren't perfect, they carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "I hope you can forgive me," Mrs. Greene added, her voice softening. The classroom was quiet, the students looking from Tiana to Mrs. Greene and back again. Slowly, Tiana nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. James watched from the back of the room, a small wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't everything he wanted, but it was a start. Later that day, James was called back to the principal's office. When he arrived, Ms. Alvarez and Principal Turner were already waiting. Their expressions were serious, their tone measured. "Mr. Brooks," Ms. Alvarez began, "first, let me thank you for your patience and persistence. Mrs. Greene's apology was a necessary step, but it's clear this issue goes deeper than one incident." James raised an eyebrow, his arms folding across his chest. "What do you mean?" Principal Turner sighed, exchanging a glance with Ms. Alvarez. "After our meeting yesterday, we decided to take a closer look at complaints filed against Mrs. Greene over the years," he explained. "What we found was troubling." James leaned forward, his heart sinking. "There have been multiple complaints from students and parents, most of them involving similar issues, comments and behaviors that seem to target minority students," Ms. Alvarez continued. "Some of these complaints were dismissed or addressed with minimal follow-up." James felt a flash of anger. "And nothing was done?" he asked, his voice sharp. "We're not proud of it," Principal Turner admitted, "but that's why we're committed to making changes now. We're launching a full investigation into Mrs. Greene's behavior, and we'll be reviewing our policies to ensure this doesn't happen again." James sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Tiana anymore. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to persist for far too long. "I appreciate you taking this seriously now," James said after a moment. "But what about the students who've already been affected? What about the ones who didn't have someone to stand up for them?" Ms. Alvarez nodded solemnly. "That's why we need your help," she said. "Your courage in speaking out has already started a ripple effect. We've had parents calling in to share their stories, and we're committed to making this school a place where every child feels safe and valued. But it's going to take all of us, parents, teachers, and the administration, to make that happen." James nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. He hadn't expected to become an advocate, but now that the door was open, he knew he couldn't walk away. As James left the office, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from another parent whose child had experienced similar treatment from Mrs. Greene. James read the message carefully, his resolve hardening with every word. What had started as a fight for his daughter had grown into a movement, and he wasn't about to stop now. That evening, James sat at his dining table, the soft hum of the overhead light filling the quiet room. His laptop was open, and emails from parents continued to pour in, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Stories of similar incidents with Mrs. Greene and even other teachers painted a troubling picture. One parent described how their son was repeatedly ignored during class discussions. Another recounted how their daughter had been accused of cheating simply because her work was too good to have been her own. James felt the weight of these stories pressing down on him. What started as a personal mission to protect Tiana had evolved into something much larger, a fight for every child who had ever been silenced or made to feel less than. Tiana walked into the room, her eyes wide with curiosity as she glanced at the screen. "Are those all from other parents?" she asked softly. James nodded. "They are," he said, "and they're all saying the same thing. This isn't just about us. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." Tiana hesitated before pulling out a chair and sitting beside her father. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked. James smiled at her, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I don't just think it'll work, Tiana. I know it will. But it's going to take time, and we're going to have to fight for it. Are you ready to be part of that fight?" Tiana nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The next week, James and a group of parents met with Ms. Alvarez and Principal Turner to discuss the next steps. The room was packed with mothers, fathers, and guardians, all eager to share their experiences and demand change. Ms. Alvarez addressed the group with a sense of urgency. "First, I want to thank all of you for coming forward. These stories are difficult to hear, but they're necessary if we're going to move forward. Our first priority is to make sure every child feels safe and respected at this school." One parent stood, their voice trembling with emotion. "Why did it take this long?" they asked. "Why did so many of us have to speak up before anyone listened?" James stood next, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Because sometimes people don't want to see the problem until it's impossible to ignore," he said. "But now that it's out in the open, we have a chance to fix it, and we're not going to stop until it's done." The room filled with murmurs of agreement, and the energy shifted. What began as frustration was turning into hope. A month later, changes were already underway. Mrs. Greene was placed on administrative leave pending the results of a thorough investigation. In the meantime, the school began implementing new diversity and inclusion training for all staff. James, now a leader in the parent advocacy group, worked closely with the school board to develop programs that fostered respect and understanding among students and teachers. Tiana was hesitant at first, but as she saw the impact of her father's efforts, she began to take pride in her role as the spark that lit the flame. One day, during an assembly held to address the school's new initiatives, James was invited to speak. Standing in front of hundreds of students and parents, he shared Tiana's story, not to shame anyone, but to highlight the importance of speaking out against injustice. "Change doesn't happen because one person stands up," James said, his voice steady. "It happens because we all stand together. My daughter taught me that, and I hope it's something we can all remember moving forward." The crowd erupted into applause, and Tiana, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. Months turned into years, and the school became an example of how a community can overcome its past. Tiana thrived, her confidence growing as she saw the ripple effects of her father's bravery. Mrs. Greene's departure marked the end of an era, but it also signaled the beginning of a brighter future for the students who followed. James often reflected on how a single moment of humiliation had transformed into a powerful movement for change. He realized that standing up for Tiana wasn't just about protecting her. It was about making sure she grew up in a world that valued her for exactly who she was. As they walked home from school one day, Tiana looked up at her father. "Dad," she said, "do you think we really made a difference?" James smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We didn't just make a difference, Tiana. We started something no one can stop." They walked together, the setting sun casting a warm glow over their neighborhood, a quiet symbol of the brighter future they had helped create.